It's 5 minutes after, so even with Jewish Standard Time, I think it's appropriate to get started. I know a lot of people have been waiting very, very patiently, and it's definitely worth the wait because tonight we have a very, very special guest. We have with us tonight at Beth Tikva an award-winning author, Nathan Englander. Nathan Englander is the author of the story collections for the relief of unbearable urges, an international bestseller, and What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank. And the novels The Ministry of Special Cases, Dinner at the Center of the Earth, and Kaddish.com. Additionally, Nathan provided the translation for the New American Haggadah. It's a wonderful Haggadah. I use it at my own Seder. His books have been translated into 22 languages, and among other prizes, he was chosen as one of the 20 writers for the 21st century by The New Yorker, is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Penn Malamud Award, a Berlin Prize, the Sue Kaufman Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2013. His play, The 27th Man, premiered at the Public Theater in 2012, and his new play, What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank, commissioned by Lincoln Center Theater, was supposed to begin running at the Old Globe in San Diego right now. Sadly, due to COVID, it wasn't the case, but on the other hand, we got to have Nathan here with us tonight instead. He is a distinguished writer in residence at New York University and lives with his family in Toronto. Many of you already know me. I'm Rabbi Sachs, and it's a pleasure, Nathan, to welcome you to our Beth Tikva community tonight and to have you with us. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Rabbi Sachs, and thank you all for coming. And I see there's Marcia and Arthur. Thanks for sponsoring this and having the idea. As you already heard, I think it's just been a year and a day or something. I am new to Toronto, but this is where we live now. I guess I've done a bunch of events around Canada over the years and in Toronto too. But I think this is, I've been lying low. We have well, he's a grown-up now. He's one too. But been laying low in town. Point is, this is my first Toronto event as a Torontonian, at least for tax purposes. I think they're already making me pay. Anyway, they start quick here. That's that. Lovely to be here. Wish we were all in person. I really hope we'll get to be in person safely soon, sneezing on each other like the old days. I guess I'm excited to be in conversation, and maybe I'll just chat for a second and read a couple of pages so you can hear my voice, and then we'll get to the nitty gritty and talk our heads off. And I think we're going to leave some time for questions, and back to the Writerly Geneva Convention. I'm sure we'll stop in an hour or less. If you're any Yankees, I know there's a lot of double passports. We got to see what Joe Biden's got to say tonight. So that's that. We'll go back to the convention for me. So this book, we're really going to talk about it. But I've been seeing a lot of pieces lately of like books that are coming out there. Like this predicted the pandemic, like all these novels that are coming out. Everyone's like, this is a perfect, they saw the pandemic coming. I'm like, if you saw the pandemic coming, you should have stopped writing your novel and probably told us to buy some N95 masks and get toilet paper, or at least called the CDC, definitely not the White House, but nonetheless, point is, books suddenly have different, they function, you build a world, and if it's functioning, it should morph over time. It should have different meanings. The books that you read in college, when you revisit them, 30 years later, 40 years later, are books as they change across time and space, like they come to have different meaning. But this book, as in the title, Kaddish.com, I was really interested in this notion of how much we live in these machines. And I literally didn't think when imagining it or writing it that I'd be doing an event this way, that there'd be something called Zoom even a couple of years ago, and that I'd actually be living inside the machine. But I was thinking of how much of our lives, our social lives, our sex lives, our secret sex lives, our politics, our families, our, all, just everything, work life. I'm just always have my face in front of a screen, usually 3 or 4 at this point. I stopped wearing an iWatch because it was just overkill and I was spending money too fast. You could just wave that thing everywhere and just beeps and you go. But yes, I really was thinking about what happens at this convergence of like mourning and the internet and grief in the internet. And that's why I was talking about prescience. Like I was not picturing a funeral, and that people that were now, the very extreme notion of literally people, burying folks over Zoom and what it's come to. But when I think of Jewish life and I think of its most pressurized, most intense form, like the biggest idea to explore, it really does come to the notion of the Kaddish. And then I thought, again, how does that fit into the internet? And that was sort of the impetus for this book. And another idea behind driving this book is, this is not my first event. You're like, you talk like it's your first event. This is how I talk. That's why I write. Then I organize, reorder, put it down on paper, clean, clean, clean. But, that notion, you start to be aware of your own process after the fact, how books form, how story forms, how idea forms. And I started to look, at the notion, of how giving mass, humor mass, and we can break that down when I talk to Rabbi Sachs and, this idea of how certain things take on meaning. But I also, I'm 20 years in, and the book that came before this one, Dinner at the Center of the Earth, was my exploration of Israel-Palestine and the failed peace process and what's, happened over the 20 years since. And it's, a literary thriller that's also a magic realist novel, that's also a romance, that's also a detective story, that's, it's got like 7 different genres and 10 different, cities in it, and it's all over the place structurally. And I really thought about where I began and what community I started in that world of sacred and profane and religious and secular. And I really wanted to go back there for this book, and that was really one of the driving forces behind it. Let me read for a couple of pages and then we will chat. Kaddish.com. Mirrors covered and front door ajar, collar torn and sporting a shadow of beard. Larry leans against the granite top of his sister's fancy kitchen island. He says, "Everyone's staring at me, all of your friends." That's what people do, Dina tells him. They come, they say kind things, they feel uncomfortable, and they stare. It's only hours after the funeral, and honestly, Larry hates himself for bringing it up. He really thought nothing could add to the despair of his father's loss, but this quiet, muttering stream of well-wishers has made it, for Larry, all the worse. What he's taking issue with is the look that he's getting. It's not the usual pain nod one naturally offers. Larry's convinced there's a bite to it, condemning. He doesn't know how he'll survive a week trapped in his sister's home, in his sister's community, when every time one of the visitors glances over, Larry feels himself appraised. And so he keeps raising his hand to the top of his head, checking for the yarmulke, sitting there like a hubcap for all its emotional weight. Its absence at his own father's shiva would be the same as standing naked before them. Sneaked off into the kitchen with his sister, their first moment alone, Larry unloads his complaints in a hiss. Tell them, he says, to stop looking my way. At a condolence call, you want them not to look at the... Dina pauses. What are we? The condoled? The aggrieved? We are the grievances. The mourner, she says. You want them not to show that they care. I want them not to judge me just because I left their stupid world. Dina laughs, her first since they put their father into the ground. This is so like you, his sister tells him, to make it negative, to complicate what can't be any more simple. This bitterness in the face of what is pure niceness is on you. On me? Are you kidding? Are you really saying that today? You know that I am, little brother. I love you, Larry, but if you choose even yes today to throw one of your fits, my fits, don't yell, Larry. People can hear. Fuck the people. Oh, that's nice. I mean it, Larry says, thinking that fit may not be a completely inappropriate word. Go on then. Curse at the terrible people who will cook for us and feed us and drive carpool for me all week and make sure that we don't mourn alone. Yes, curse at the nice men who washed our father's body and prepared the shroud and laid the shards atop his eyes and now come to make a minion in this house. Spare me, Dina. It's my mourning too, and I should get to feel at home in your home as much as them. Who's saying different? But you have to understand, they aren't used to it, Larry, used to what you do. Dina takes a breath, reorganizing her thoughts. Memphis Jews are even more conservative than the ones we grew up with. In Brooklyn, even the edgeless have an edge. Here, if you're going to be radical, people may a little bit stare. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nathan.
My pleasure.
To jump into questions, actually, I was thinking a lot about how the book begins with that chapter at the Shiva, where Larry really is an outsider. In a sense, it's the world he grew up in, but he left the traditional fold. But for those that have read the book, not to give spoilers, he comes back to religion later as he becomes Reb Shuli.
Yeah.
But again, even there, he's an outsider when it comes to technology. He's never really in a world he belongs in. So what strikes me is in literature, it helps you to really see the perspective of someone that you wouldn't necessarily feel. But the question is, if we had the review of the side characters, do you think, are we all outsiders in some degree? Like he's looking at everyone else who feels comfortable as an outsider, but what do you think they feel?
Oh, that's such a good question. You're like, I didn't come here to ask you to rate my questions, but I really like that question. Oh, I guess, I mean, now we get into like proprioceptive relationship. I may have a doctor friend. I told my mom and one friend about the event, but like how we move our fingers without thinking, move fingers, move. You know, I have a very different relationship with the characters in that I have to play every part at once. I have to be me, and I have to be you, and I have to be the people watching, and I have to be the nice tech person who's running the Zoom and making sure we don't get Zoom bombed. So, yeah, I guess I don't interact with those people. Like I know their weight and their mass, and I shift into them as necessary. So I guess I haven't thought. I see them as seeing Larry as other, but when you get into otherness, you know, I just passed my 20th anniversary of my first book. It was 99 in the last millennium, not even the century. But I see how much I've always felt other. And that's like, I really thank you for that question. That is central to who he is. I noticed that, like, you know, I always call us Mayflower Jews. Like my parents are American, my grandparents, it's my great greats that came over, a few of them. So it's just that notion where I'm like, yet I grew up in the States religious and feeling a hyphenated American, a kind of American, a lot of what people are fighting for in the States, which is like nobody gets to blame. I am plenty American, but yet I felt like a little Jew in America. And then when I went to Israel, instead of feeling Jewish, I finally felt American. You know, it's like this idea, I always feel outside and other, and I move around a lot, and my identity shifts in that way. And I think that's one of the things that I was looking at in, Larry, who becomes Shuli. And no, we can't talk without that spoiler. There is a jump and he is born again. And when I talked about the mass that jokes have, that's what I was thinking of is a lot of us, my yeshiva made two kinds of people. I grew up Orthodox, and they really minted two kinds of students, which is kids with beards down to the floor today, girls and boys both, or people who won't set in foot in shul on Yom Kippur, won't have anything. They make us or break us. That was the only thing. But so many friends are better at not being religious than me. I'm so bad at not being religious. You know what I'm saying? I always call myself like a failed atheist. I really try not to be God-fearing all the time. So back to the joke part is I get always teased a lot of how like hair trigger I am, that my wife's going to come home and find me nailing up 13 mezuzahs and koshering the kitchen. It'd be really easy for me to like flip that way. And then I thought about this switch. Like here I am, gray at the temples, and I still end up, so much of my identity is about I was religious and then I'm not. And I thought, wouldn't that flip make more sense? You know what I'm saying? You can switch political parties, you can switch sports teams, you can only do it once. If you became a Raptors fan, last year, nobody's going to accept it if you switch to whoever wins this year, which will be the Raptors again, first Toronto event. Anyway, but nonetheless, so yes, I was just thinking about these multiplicity of selves we have and how easy that trigger is, what it is for him to miss that world, as I often miss that world. But yes, so I wanted to look at that flip, but that outsider, as you said, it is central to who I am. And there's a lot of me that I put in this character. And it's, yes, that notion of always feeling other. I've always felt other. And my last event before this was there was the one that I was maybe going to do, and then the one that we're like, finally, no more flying. We all needed to stop meeting earlier, but we needed that information from, again, let's not get back into politics. You can switch to the convention. They could have told us sooner in the States. But yeah, March 5th in Connecticut, where like we don't have a case. That was the super spreader night. I was in that town. But I remember saying how I also feel like a little boy. I said, I'm 50 years old and I feel like a little boy. And I almost started crying at the end. This guy came up to me. He must have been like 75, 78, maybe 86 and looking really good. But, you know, he said to me, I still feel like a little boy too. I never heard anyone say that. And I feel like there's a certain kind of person, which I am, that I always feel other or always feel unsure. And that's a lot of that, or always feel like a little kid. And a lot of that's inside Larry Shuley.
I think it's very funny, the idea that any moment you might be, as you said, nailing 13 mezuzot up around the house. And it's had me thinking a little bit, because lately I find when I see the Orthodox community depicted in TV and movies, it tends to be a very one-sided, very negative portrayal. Yeah. But what I really like is these are full characters. There's good and bad, both in these and then in your short stories when you depict the religious community. But I'm curious, not to quote another author, but I always loved in The Chosen when the main character Reuben's complaining about the Siddim and his father responds to him at the end. He just nods and says, "But we still can't sing and dance like they do." Yeah. My question is, going back to your previous life or the years you grew up in the Orthodox community, are there things that you miss? What are the things that you look back on and go like, I wish we could have that still in a secular kind of, or in a less traditional world?
Oh, so yeah. And I was going to say, I was like, who's he going to quote? Robbie Benson. I was like, speaking of books to movie, that's best Hasidic portrayal ever. There's a really good episode of High Maintenance. That's one of the best Hasidic persons he's very stoned, but he's really good. But, oh, that's nice. Yeah, I miss it all the time. I always say like I'm still trained. I once saw a speaker, I was in Berlin and he couldn't adjust his speech. It was so framed. He's like, I'm just going to pretend I'm in America for speaking. So he'd say, here we are. And I was like, you can adjust your speech. But I was going to say, you've all made the effort to come here, but you've all made the effort to sign in and virtually be here. So I was like, I always really feel, don't do these if you're not going to be honest. After I'll be really wired. Rabbi Sachs and I said, you know, going to have a virtual drink. But the point is, you know, just be honest. Like, yeah, we all get hit with like COVID moments, like days where you're cheery or days where it seems really terrifying, the future, and, you know, California's on fire already again, all that stuff. Like, I literally stopped today. I was like, I was driving by, I was like, got out of my car. I'm like, I'm going to buy me some egg kichel at this bait. You know what I'm saying? Like, stuff like that. There's, you know, the Madeline sense memory. I'm very big fan of beige desserts. The less flavor, the better. Just beige sugar. But yeah, food, you know, food, music, culture, all that stuff is giant to me. I still go back to those books. This is my research shelf. I always say there's lots of people who play the shelf game to see what's behind your head. So I may be less of a fan than Rommel the Desert Fox. You know, who knows what's back there? There'll be like 10 Nazi books behind my head. I'll be like, that's for a novel I'm working on. Anyway, but yeah, almost everything is, I still live with so much of that stuff. And also in this moment, by the way, there's a lot of posers. You cannot be, and it's not some like, you know, what you expect of me as like Brooklyn lefty New Yorker transplant, like, but it is true. You cannot be like, there's Bein Adam L'Chaveru and Bein Adam L'Makom, like your relationship between man or between person and God and, you know, between people, like back to what we atone for on Yom Kippur, you have to get forgiveness from people. I really do like the ethics of that world. There's a lot of people pretending to be religious and then doing extraordinarily horrible things. And I'm not talking about like that I want to bust on some wedding. I'm talking about like in the States right now, these like fake portrayals of empathy where like great harm is being done to the planet, to humanity, to our endless dead in one of the world's, or if not the world's richest country. So I really miss the very clear ethics that I grew up with. Like, honestly, they still drive my life in a lot of ways. So yes, I can talk about egg kichel, or, you know, my wife is like, she can't believe how much matzah I eat. She's like, it's August. Like, why all the matzah never stops? It's not just for Pesach. But yeah, for me, honestly, I really do. I grew up with a great sense of empathy and a great sense of order. And I think part of what drives my work is I find it very hard to live without that order. Like I've remade my ethical order because there's things I really believe that are not halachic or don't fit, where you'd say, well, that's wrong. And I say, well, I'm saying that's right. But that gray space haunts me. And I really do like, there really is, that's it now. We'll give, if I say right now, we're having this event on Thursday night, if, you know, so Rabbi Sachs says it's Thursday night. If I say on this thing that it's Tuesday, literally in America, they'll put you on the news for 4 hours and let us each have equal time. It's Thursday. There's like nothing to discuss. You know what I'm saying? And there's literally there's a different kind of pandemic, which is a loss of a concept of right and wrong. You know what I'm saying? You don't put kids in cages. You don't, what you could just things. We help people now. It's an emergency. Like that's all. Put your mask on. This is not a valid position to infect others. That's what I'm saying. That's not a political position. It's not a moral position. It's not a religious position. It's just ignorant and in fact just plain mean-spirited and selfish. So I'm saying I miss right and wrong because that is a thing that really does exist. It's Thursday, 2 + 2 is 4, and wear a mask when you go into a store. I wish we were them in the streets here, but our numbers are great. Keep going, Canada. Food. No evil eye.
So I, like you, I'm actually an American transplant here to Canada. And while I try to stay out of politics, I share your feelings. I was very happy when I came here to see that conservative in Canada meant something very different than conservative in the US when we're talking about politics.
Oh my God, yes, I'm very enjoying your scandals where people are like, you're caught, and then they say, I'm wrong, and now I'm gonna step down. I was like, yes, that's how it works. You can cheat, but if you get caught, you need to say, I'll step down now.
So I wanna ask you, because Larry throughout the story seems like he's always looking for a meaning. His wife talks about his time away was part of a larger plan. He finds meaning in a overbearing Jewish mother coming to Jerusalem following her, the newlyweds on their honeymoon, right? Everything he's finding, searching for meaning. And when you read a book, I was trying to guess, is this, the author's view, or is this something he's trying to represent? So my question to you is, you also mentioned the holidays, as we enter the holiday and we talk about God writing us in the book of life, in the book of death, the judgments of the year to come, I'm curious your own personal view, if you think that there is an order to the world, if things do happen for a reason, or if we're just here and have to make the best of it as we go along.
Oh, that is, makes me think. Like all of the above. I mean, I think that's why I ended up a fiction writer and not, teaching math. There's other reasons. Mrs. Rosenzweig, if she were here, she would tell you why I'm not a math teacher. I tried, but I do like numbers. But yeah, like, I mean, I think that I really believe in like a bifurcated brain. There's many different versions of me, but in that writing self, I do believe like one becomes religious about different things. I'm really religious about fiction, about my belief in story, about craft. And when you also ask from childhood, it's that story. Those stories are really real to me and have really shaped me and still also really guide a lot of things in my life. I go back to that well. I've never said that phrase before. I go back to that well, but I do go back to it all the time. But, what I guess, as someone who spends a lot of time writing, if you think about something long enough, there really does seem to be an order. Like there's nothing, I'm not, please do send compliments. I appreciate that. No, but if you compliment, I'm one of those people, my wife was just like feeling bad for me this week. Like there's nothing, I'm like a sitcom Jew where if I get something positive, it's already negative or I'm sad or, you know what I'm saying? Like, if you give me whatever, a Ferrari as a present, I'll be like, oh, I wanted a blue one. This is red. Like I'm just, it's hard for me to accept. The only compliment I want as a fiction writer, or the only, not compliment, feedback, is the thing that moves me, that like lets me test my pitch and my tuning, is when I write about worlds I can't have known about before I was born, places I hadn't been, and somebody says, how do you know? Or that's just how it was. Like those are the things that I, keep close to my heart. So yes, if you sit with an idea, if you think something long enough, like, just, if I pick a face, a wonderful face on this screen, I really think I could say, give me 3 years or maybe 5, I'm going to write your life. And I think if I think hard enough and sit with it and research enough and ponder, really order forms. It's just shocking to me. There are society, and the way history repeats. Like, that's the other thing. Order does form. I do think there's an order to the world, and that's it. Like, if I'm being my religious self, I'll be like, it's fated, it's not. But also the cycles are so clear. When we see the crazy conspiracy theories that we have now, that are so insane. I was just looking back at the 1928 election, where, I was thinking back, it's after the Spanish flu, it's right before the crash. I was thinking 100 years ago, basically. And literally Al Smith, a Catholic, which to them was, probably as big as Obama's win if a Catholic had won in 1928. And they were spreading the same kind of kookamonga rumors. The Holland Tunnel in New York had just opened, and they said Al Smith, who was running for president, he was the governor, he built this tunnel to open it so he can bring the Pope through to install him in the White House so that the Pope can run America. You know what I'm saying? So it's not only that there's an order of the world, it seems to me a repetitive cycle of the 100-year pandemic, the economics, the paranoia. We used to have the Know Nothing Party, and if there's, we got plenty of Know Nothing in the States right now. So yes, I do think there's an order, but I also think it doesn't matter, back to like ideas of Jewishness and how we live our lives. Like, it doesn't matter if there's God or no God. God gave us the knowledge that there's global warming and the science, which means we need to change our ways and not rely. I don't think it changes how we act, but I do, in a weird way, think just on the story front, the things I have dreamed, they will either repeat or, pan out in a certain way, and sometimes they're self-fulfilling. This book, by the way, when I had the idea for it, I'm like, I didn't want to write a book called Kaddish.edu or Kaddish.net or Kaddish.ca. I wanted Kaddish.com. I'm like, weirdly, in my office in Brooklyn, I was like, if this website is empty, I'm going to write this novel. I made that weird deal with myself. It was empty. I tried to buy it then. Once I drafted, I was like, I want this for my book. They wouldn't sell it. They would, going through the machine to the other machine. Then the publisher, they just wouldn't sell to us. We couldn't get the site forever. And then I got a call from a journalist like 6 months after the book came out to say how I felt about the site going live. But whoever owned the site, I think, read the novel. We won't give away the ending. We need to give away a lot, but there's twists and turns. But yes, read the novel till the end. And he's like, I like that idea. So even sometimes when you make an order, the order will become manifest. So I wrote the book Kaddish.com, but now there is literally a website where you can sign up and hire a mourner to grieve for you on Kaddish.com. So yes, things break their boundaries.
So you talk about how you decided that this was going to be something you wrote. You made this deal with yourself. And before you mentioned that really, if you got to know us, you could write our stories as well. I'm not envious of your job. I have to write sermons each week, but I have a topic. I have something I have to write about. You can pick anything that you want to. How do you decide that this is something you want to put on paper and put out there versus just a fleeting funny thought that you're going to let just kind of float away?
That is, I look to the side as if there's someone with cue cards who's going to answer the question. Every time you ask a question, I seem to be looking over here tonight as if there's someone who's going to.
Is there someone?
It's a teleprompter. By the way, I did this thing for PBS NewsHour, which is everyone probably knows what that is here, but it's in the States. It's the public news hour, like the CBC. Anyway, but it's the only time I had to read what I set up a teleprompter. I think it took 11 hours for 2 minutes. Like, everyone wanted to go, I'm so bad at a teleprompter. So when you watch the convention, at least, even if you don't like what's being said, admire when politicians, I find it extraordinarily hard to speak in an ordered teleprompter fashion. But, oh yeah, I'm just like, I did back-to-back. I usually have a decade. I really wrote back-to-back books. And then I spent the last year rewriting this play Round the Clock, which didn't get to open, which is honestly back to humbling lessons. If the theater is, I wish the theater well. I love my actors. Like, we were about to start rehearsals. I hope that we, again, all can sit together and do things like that. But I said, like, it really was humbling, where I thought this is what most artists do. They make things and that you don't necessarily get to share your novel or your story. Like, I feel it made me ponder, to just reflect upon how thankful I am to get to do what I do. But it has been at least, I've been back to back, like 3 projects in a row. It's got to be like, 6 years, 7 since I've had to start something new. And I have to say, I'm back in it, and it is not easy to think now for any of us. By the way, if you're a creative person or just like to work out or whatever you do, if you like are having trouble, we're at a show, a synagogue. My point is, if you can't concentrate when you're down, like nobody's brain is work. Like I think we all need back to before we ask forgiveness. If it's that time of the year, we should all forgive ourselves a little. I'm finding it really hard to like get to a dissociative state more than usual. I can work, I've tested, I've worked through wars. I can do I can pay attention under a lot of different shocking circumstances. But this is particularly confusing because the world has no order. Back to your idea of order, like why I was looking at the last pandemic is like, how do we see a shape to this? But I think what it is everything seems like a great idea. Why you need friends to trust, I trust my wife as first reader, my agent, different people that I talk to, as I get a million ideas. I'm drowning in ideas for which I'm thankful. And then I'll be like, what about an egg, but it's sentient and it also drives a school bus? And my wife will be like, that does not sound, as I talk about 1928 and Al Smith, I'll be like, do you know the Holland Tunnel opened? And she'd be like, that sounds boring to me, even as a concept. Anyway, but I think so much of what you're saying of what this goes back to the fate question is, and it's again what's happening politically around the world, which is we now have dual realities. Israel's a good example. For a million years, where the Israelis and the Palestinians, they have separate realities, not separate positions. Like realities can function at the same time. What a writer does, we all daydream. You may be daydreaming right now, in fact, where you're instead of listening to me. But the point is, we all at moments look away. It's why you can't text and drive. We're going to make this all public service announcements. I'm like, wear a mask, don't text and drive. But I'm just saying, what happens when you hopefully kill no one but yourself and also you be safe? But why you can't text and drive is you think you're conscious, but we all lose consciousness a million times a day. So you're driving, you send a text, and there's a moment where you're just not there. And that's what's dangerous for all of us on the sidewalk. And I think what writers do is as a group, or, anyone who makes anything, is you train yourself to like expand those moments of day, to give them form. They basically, I have a million ideas, I write them all, and then one of them starts to take over my consciousness. And at some point I'm really respectful of it. It's a very strange thing. At some point it becomes as real to me as the reality that I'm in. I see those apartments, I see those people. Like I always think of this Argentina novel, my second book, it took me almost a decade to write. I spent more time in that apartment in Buenos Aires than in like any house I've lived in. I can just see it now, you know what I'm saying? And slowly the parts connect up and it becomes to me the same as memory, as living consciousness, and then it just takes over your life. And why I'm answering so long is because right now I am suffering immeasurably. It's both an exciting time when you're full of ideas, but it's also, I'm writing about a farm, then I'm writing about a pizza place, then I'm writing about the Visigoths, whatever, William the Conqueror, like it just goes everywhere. And then the world falls away and then it takes over my whole life.
Previously I've heard you, when you speak, you've talked about how it was really great when that second book finally came out, because you joked at first you were just telling people you wrote book, and it was nice to say
yes.
you wrote books.
Yes.
But now you have really quite the impressive resume. I know myself, when I first graduated rabbinical school, was asked to speak to someone, they asked for a resume. I had nothing really that I could put in.
Yes.
President of the fraternity, I don't know what they
you put down proficient in Word.
I put voted America's cutest rabbi by his mother, but not in consecutive years.
That's funny.
Which
I like that.
Was my attempt. But now that you don't have to make jokes anymore about writing book, you've written books, you're award-winning short stories. Now you're the first play, and now the second play that God willing we'll get to see at some point.
I'll take that.
What are there other goals for you? Are there other things that you'd like to add to that resume, new areas, or is it continuing in these formats that you see yourself?
You know what? It's I really like it. We'll see if the dog wanders in. Her hip is sore this week. We're all getting older together. Point is, I always, think the example I always use is a gymnast where I'm I give a friend, she's a prima ballerina, but she's retired. Like she's been retired since we were like 12. You know what I'm saying? If you're a prima ballerina, you move out of your house at like 10 years old and then you dance, for 15 years and then I was like, you're retired, It's really a crazy notion. So yeah, there are these glorious things that are not permanent positions necessarily, gymnast being one, like your shoulders, everything starts to fret, like they retire young. So what I love about the writing life is like, it always feels like it's for all the marbles. Every book feels like the first book in such an extreme manner. And yeah, it always feels new. Every time I feel like I'm going to figure it out this time. And the one thing someone just brought her up was with my older child in the park, much like books and saying for a decade I wrote book and now I say I write books. But yes, now that we have a second child, it's just 1 year. Every time I say kids, I'm like kids. Anyway, Anyway, Nora Ephron came up in the park, who was very influential to me and a friend and who I miss. And like, I've been thinking about her. She came into mind. I thought, oh, she was like the best cub reporter at the New York Post. And then like a great journalist. I was like, oh, then she was a great novelist. I was like, then she was a great screenwriter. Then she was a great director. Then she became like an essayist. And I think of certain friends like her or, artists in the world, whether friends or not. And I thought, oh, this is such a dumb thing to become like epiphonic that it just hits me. But in the last few years or a couple of years, I've been thinking of myself as someone who tells stories. I thought about like, I didn't want to do that Haggadah, which, Jonathan Safran Foer was the editor of. And he's like, you're doing it. He like so knows my brain and tortured me into doing it. And I was like, and then Edgar Keret, the wonderful Israeli writer, like I translated, parts of a couple of his books. It's like, oh, that's one way to tell a story. And the plays, like now it's 2 plays. I'm like, it's another way to tell a story. There's a wonderful, download the podcast, listen to it, but I Love the Moth, which is this wonderful storytelling thing in America. I always look crazy on the subway, or most of us do. But, I'm laughing, I'm crying, like it's just so moving, where it's just live storytelling. You walk to a microphone, you tell a story, they have these very big rooms, hundreds and hundreds of people, and you just walk out there, no introduction really, and you tell a story. And I thought that's like the most ancient, basic form, like oral storytelling. So yes, I really just, like what's ahead or what's exciting to me is the notion like story in all its form. Like, even now, I'll be like, oh, I should write a TV show. Like, I may pretend to be a writer or to be educated or have a religious background. The one thing somebody of my vintage has, our parents put us in front of the TV. I probably watched 18 hours a day solid and pretend I have a stomach ache to stay home from school. Literally just, I was like, oh, now you can tell really good when you mentioned like Jews on TV, like I'm sure a bunch of you have watched Unorthodox or Shtisel or, there's these, it's just a great moment for TV right now. So yes, I'm just interested in story in all its forms. That's really the identity now.
Right, so we have a lot to look forward to then from you, of all sorts of formats potentially in the future. You mentioned the translations you did, both for
Right.
Edgar Keret stories as well as for the new American Haggadah. And I always, when I teach a text and I'm teaching from the English, I always try to explain to my class that the translation is really a commentary in a sense.
Yes.
That you can't understand it without the original. So I'm curious, how is that different from picking words when you're writing your own stories, picking words to explain the Haggadah or someone else's story? Is there a different pressure there when you're creating a translation?
Oh no, that's like that. So everything ends up being why. Also, back to the previous question, why I fell in love with other story forms. If you're going to be a fiction writer, nobody will take you seriously, and even after you maybe get serious, maybe still nobody takes you seriously. It's very hard to protect your time, and I always feel like my job is to, protect that time. So even doing these other forms, I'm like, no, they're going to steal from story and novel writing, which is my job. Like, I don't want to do your Haggadah. I don't want to do this play. But you learn so much doing those other forms and translation, spending that time. I think about word choice compulsively. And again, it starts to swim at the end. My poor editor, I'll be like, I said the, and on the last page, I'll be like, yes, that word, and is a connector. You can say and more than once in a book. But sitting there with a sentence, especially starting with something like a Haggadah, which is, the Haggadah is like 90%, Tanakh. It's just the Torah. It's just Torah quotes mostly and a couple of good medieval rhyming poems, you know. So just thinking about like the infinite word choice, your responsibility. Are you doing the meaning or the feeling or the rhythm? Yeah, breaking it down. Both processes are exactly the same in that way, but translation, you have a, I'm not responsible to myself, I'm responsible to someone else. And the weight of that was, it was really great to take back to my fiction. But yes, it's, you go down these rabbit holes. It is a writing is really, really a compulsive act. And I always say, if your book needs 50 years, spend 50 years writing it. If you spend 50 years in a day, you lost your mind. But 50 years, take like, to me, it's so nerdy, but that love of language, it's really, really, it runs deep, and I spend a lot of time at it. And of the things, even the things one complains about as like a kid or a teenager, when you're bitter, when you leave a world, that I'm not thankful for, I'm thankful for all the things that they had us, you know, praying about and reading that they never taught us the translations to. You know, when I became an adult and I lived in Israel for years and I worked really hard on getting fluent in Hebrew, which is now mostly gone. In a lot of ways, it's still there and rusty. But it's like, then you read these things we said when we were little. I was like, and it's like, may I tear my enemy's head off and kick him in the knees. I was like, oh my God, is that what I was saying? But I even think having memorized large tracts of like ancient Hebrew prayers and not knowing what I was saying has so affected my love of language, because it also made me love rhythm. I have these whole giant things that I knew by heart that I did not, you know, had no idea what Adon Olam means, or, you know, but I just knew it. So yes, it's both love of language and love of the sound of things.
Well, Adon Olam is one of the good ones. It always struck me, the tunes we use in the Musaf Amidad on Shabbat, where we're really singing about sacrifice.
Yeah.
These happy, happy songs about a lamb going to the slaughter.
Yes.
But you mentioned there the idea that, you know, if it takes you 50 years to write your book, that's great. 50 years in a day, it's crazy. Again, for me, I have a deadline. The sermon is on Saturday. At some point, I have to stop editing and I have to just give it. But if I didn't have that, I don't know how I would ever decide that this was done, that there was no word I would change. How do you decide that you're done, that everything is?
You really, I used to, I don't make, you know, it wasn't even funny then to have a gun reference. I used to use the NRA when they cried for my cold dead hands, but it truly is a separate pandemic that also, let's talk about gun violence too. Another PSA, lock up your weapons. Yeah, there is really, there's this, we don't have time for it. I know we want to take a couple questions too, but I have a 9-hour story in my brain about this Gerhard Richter painting that obsesses me. There is a point, you know, basically y'all play Jenga. If you play Jenga, like that's it. You can't set up Jenga and say I win before you start. And you know, you gotta pull the pieces. And then at some point, there is an absolute right. We started, you know, it's come up a few times, but the religious part of me, I really believe things have a true and perfect form. You know what I'm saying? And then there's idea, every religion has a story. I think I'm sure there's a Jewish version, a Muslim version, but someone once actor friend gave me a lovely letter talking about Navajo, I think it was Navajo blankets, but about putting in a broken stitch. Anything made by a human being should have an imperfection in it to show that it is made by human hands. And I love that notion. So I think even imperfect is perfect. You find its true form, and that's when you let it go. But the sermon thing is not small. Maybe we should switch places, or you should just become a novelist. Like journalists, people who have to closers end up being great fiction writers, because I don't care. I mean, it's different now that I'm married and have kids. Like, it's less charming to couch surf. I'm more concerned if I'm like, you know, there's responsibility that comes with parenthood. Like, you don't need to tell that to this audience, but I'm just saying that I really don't care. I would work on the same, you know, I'd work on a haiku for the rest of my life if that's what I was interested in. But I do think people like you have to have a sermon. It learning to close, you know, whether it's Hemingway or modern friends like, you know, Sasha, different friends who were journalists, they're so good at just closing, because it also makes you see that it feels like life and death, but so much in life, you know, in this time, especially clear, life and death is life and death. And a lot of stuff feels like it, but it isn't. And that's it. Your congregation loves you. They support you. Like, you know, they can all be great. And some of them can be less, you know, you can have a week where you're like, it is so good to live in the reality and the continuum. I think it really, yes, having deadlines really serves people, but a book has no deadline, or I ignore them.
I certainly don't want to trade. It's I think you have the tough job there. But I'm gonna ask one more question, but I want to just let everyone know, if you have questions you would like me to ask Nathan, you can type them in the chat to me, and we'll do a couple of audience questions before we wrap up. So you can type them and send them to me in the chat box right now. And while I do that, Nathan, I just wanted to ask you about your short story, what we talk about when we talk about Anne Frank. I'm not sure if everybody on here has read it. I highly encourage everybody to. But there's a game that the characters play in it, and I was hoping you could elaborate for us a little bit. I don't want to give anything away, so much of I'm allowed to.
So no, this is.
Love you to talk about it.
So my first play, which is back to mentioning Nora Ephron, that's how I met her, is she produced it. But it was an adaptation of my story, The 27th Man, the first story in my first book, which is set in Stalinist Russia. That was not the question. My new play is also an adaptation of a story, the title story from that book, what we talk about Anne Frank. And I guess when it is literally, when I talk about the different stages where now, you know, this decade, I'm like, oh, I'm a storyteller. What does that mean to just tell stories in any form that I want? That can be, you know, build a diorama with my kid. That's a story, you know, like, but one thing that happened a few years ago is so many writers extraordinarily closely mine their own history, and their first books are really close to their experience, and then they move farther and farther afield. But I'm so much, really, I'm so private, like I'm open. I don't know how to say that. Like, I'm not shy, as you can see, because I'm just sitting here talking my head off and feel close to all of you while we do this. And we will keep that bond. But yeah, there's a certain way where, to me, to be why I love fiction. I'm not a nonfiction writer, you know, I may do that too, but to get close, I had to go far. So dreaming of being a writer, back to that story, The 27th Man, I just wanted to explore what it meant to be a writer. And instead of writing about myself, you know, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, you know, in my tiny apartment, dreaming of being a writer, I said it in a, you know, that I explored that idea in a secret Stalinist, you know, prison in 1952. I think I still have the year right. So in that same way, as the years went by, I was like, oh, I will look closely. Back to being so American and so many generations here, but our Jewish education, our yeshiva education was so Holocaust based. It, you know, permeated everything, that my sister and I, just our personal shorthand for, really, I can't remember time, for our whole lives, if we'd meet like a couple of friends or some couple that my sister and I would meet, our shorthand was about trust, like if they would hide us in the event of a second Holocaust. Like, oh yeah, he would hide us, she would turn us in. Not a joke, seriously, just our shorthand, and we really mean it. We don't have anyone in our lives, you know, that we don't think would hide us in a sec. Like, we're not close with anyone that we don't think like they would really take us in, you know? It's such a, and I must have been 45 years old or 40 years old when I wrote that story, like 40. And I never thought, well, that's deeply pathological. It just popped into my head, that notion. I was like, I bet everyone doesn't do this to make order. And so I built a story around it. And one of the sweet things about putting stories in the world, where I say, you know, people like, that I get to hear who things ring true to, or what's that like. I've had so many moving talks about people and the Kaddish, especially people. This is about a proxy. This book explores a lot this notion about the proxy. Like, I've talked to so many people on the road when I could travel who hired people to say the Kaddish for them. It's been very moving. I have a story about a Jewish Santa Claus. I've met every Jewish Santa Claus in North America. I thought I made up the notion. They come to the events to tell me I too am a Jewish Santa Claus. But what was really moving to me when what we talk about came out was how many different cultures, how many people play this same game with their own cultural trauma, like the, you know, Underground Railroad escaped slave version. You know, I remember someone telling me about, they played the Basque separatist version. It was really moving to me that, and most cultures, back to how you started this talk as we go to questions about people feeling other, anyone who might be the kind of person to feel a sense of otherness, like culturally, religiously, sexual identity, I don't even know how to, anyway, but the point is, however you identify on all those fronts, I think, though, like, if you feel other in that way and have historical persecution, almost everyone has this aversion of this game. And it was really moving to me, people who thought, like, I never thought anyone else played this, but I played it. And especially on the Jewish front, like, infinity people have come up to me and say, like, I play this game in my house, which is not a game. The game that's not a game, that's a pathology.
Exactly, but that to me is I never realized that it was something I was playing until I read it, and it really for me put in perspective, because today there's a lot of talk about Jews. Are we a minority? Are we not? And there's a lot of debate sometimes in the world. And well, I recognize we have privilege in the sense of I can put a baseball cap on and not show my otherness in some places. Right. But I think it really, like you said, it relates. It captures that feeling I think a lot of Jews have, that that at any moment the world
experientially. And you talk about that, like, that's awesome, and it's like such a, so important, but notions of privilege, but that's the point. But I didn't, I mostly didn't wear that. I mostly, like, that's it, it's choosing to otherfy yourself. You can't change the color of your skin, but you can put a yarmulke on. Like, that is when you feel people behind you in a certain time. Like, there are different ways of experiencing the world that, like, yes, it is very global in that way and across the board. And again, become very real in the States, where we are, snatching people up. Like, it is not, you can really have the question, if someone undocumented and, ISIS come, like, we are literally, tearing families apart. And, like, I that's when I talk about books changing. I had to rethink this story when I was living in the States last year, and rethink this story and say, would I hide this person? If someone came up to me and said, take my kid, they're, like, they don't have, I had to think my own story and say, oh my God, that's how quickly the world changes. Like, this is what, the country is now.
Wow. One of the questions we have from the audience is the title of the lecture was Guilt, Memory, and the Beta God. We didn't really get a chance to talk about Beta God.
Great.
So you came up with the title. I want to let you explain what you meant by that.
Yes. I guess, so this notion, I was the kid, I wish I was naughtier. I think there's, about 18 places to buy marijuana. If you want to smoke weed or eat it or drink it, there's about 10 shops, next to the library, and, like, it's just everywhere in this neighborhood. Point is, in the States, where it is surely, it was probably forbidden here then too. Point is, I wasn't the naughty kid. I wasn't drinking. I wasn't sneaking out. I wasn't smoking pot. I was, like, my whole rebellion is so embarrassingly theological. I was the kid who would question, some syllogism of Maimonides and get thrown out, But I think one of the things I was like, one of the things that made me not religious, maybe, like, was this notion of omniscience. Like, this idea that God could know everything that I have ever done, what I'm doing now, and I still have free will, but what I will likely intend to do next. And thank you, whoever that is, for that question. It's literally the title of the thing, and we didn't get to it. But in this book, why I love fiction, there's no room for being a lecturer. There's no room for being didactic. That literally poisons the whole thing. If you want to change, I'm not trying to change someone's mind. I'm trying to get us to explore, to think, to rethink how we think, to look at it, that I look at it and hope you look at it with me, and we see the world maybe differently after we go through something together. So yes, God not only can know what I did, but what you did, what you did, what you did, what every one of us has done, what everyone in the world is doing, and then again, what we're currently doing and what we will do, but we still have choice. And I thought that is such a giant ask. It hurts my brain, as a kid, and hurts my brain now to still think the size of it. And what Shuli did, back to when we say different ideas of privilege, which is, in the global South, say, access to the internet, back to homeschooling and what's going on now. You need a bunch of computers, like a lot of people are fortunate to have it. To get on the internet is one kind of privilege. To be able to stay off it, that's what the fancy people do. You know what I'm saying? You go to the tech billionaires, their kids are not glued to a screen. They're playing with a wooden toy. You know what I'm saying? So Shuli, when he becomes born again in the book, has stayed away from technology. He's just free of it. And when he goes back in, what he's shocked to discover is what the internet has built, and it's so new, and that's the beta God. Like, in a sense, I had to think about it, and I say those rabbis, you know, the rabbi thinking, I think he is now long gone, but almost I'd want to talk to him and tell him, I see your point now. Like, I get the idea of omniscience, because literally, you're on Zoom. Any of you here, and with CCTV, with the cameras, any of you has held a modern cell phone or sitting at this computer or walked through a wired city, like literally, the internet knows every single thing you've done, literally everything you've done. It knows what we're all doing now, where we are. And I don't know about you, but like I don't do, you know, Facebook really, like I stay off of Twitter. I try to do my work back to that kind of, you know, focus that I work towards. But I like the Instagram. Lately, that's the one I spend the most time on. But it's not a little bit creepy. It's not partially accurate. It's not like, oh, I'm hungry and it guesses that it's probably around the time that I eat and it offer me food. It's like, it knows if I want like hot Doritos or if I'm like, I want a Coke Zero, not a Diet Pepsi and not a Diet Coke. Like I want, you know, the ads are literally, it is shockingly predictive. You know what I'm saying? I think back to this baby, I think we found out my wife was pregnant because Instagram offered me like baby stuff before we even knew. You know what I'm saying? It is so creepy. And I thought, my God, it's not global because there's some people, there are still places on this planet, few and far between, where they're not plugged in, or some people who maybe manage to wear a tinfoil hat and stay off. But we have literally built a beta God in terms of omniscience, where you know, and that's, this book also has ideas of heaven and notions of heaven and hell that I grew up with. When I was really little, they gave us happy notions of heaven and hell. And then I really embrace them for this book. They're really central. Once you hit puberty, the rabbis really lay in, and then they give you these horrible versions. When you die, you're watching a movie of your life. God's on one side and your mom's sitting on the other. Everybody's eating popcorn. No 13-year-old boy wants to watch that movie. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's this idea, we got these really sharp visions of it, and I feel like, in a sense, in some ways, you know, back to, and there's whether you're pro-cancel culture, against cancel culture, I don't even know the origins of cancel culture, which was kind of a joke on Black Twitter, I believe, is its true origin that broke its boundaries. But like this idea where somebody's saying, you said this on Twitter, you know, 12 years ago, and, you know, like the idea, I say, it's not only a beta God, the internet, it's a Jewish God. It's not any New Testament God. It is fully wrathful and unforgiving. It will come for you. And I thought, this is what I was told, that everything you've done will be on record and it will be there to tear you apart, so behave.
I'm going to go turn off all of my Siri and Alexa devices immediately.
Oh, those, yeah.
I'm terrified.
Those are the worst. Yeah.
We have a question about your process, and it's going back to this book, thekaddish.com. The question actually is there. Were there parts of the story that got drastically changed, or sections that got cut that aren't? You don't have to tell us necessarily what they are. But is it a whole nother book in a sense than what it was at some point along the journey?
Yeah, they all are. So again, things change. Pretty much every single thing I've ever written in my whole life has been at least twice as long, but probably 4 times as long or 10 times as long. You know, they become an education. That story, The 27th Man, that I talked about, like I got the idea whatever I was, 19, and then wrote it a couple years later, and then drafted it for like a decade. You know, where those things that I measure in pounds or feet, you know, like it's just endless drafts and redrafts. Like that's a lot of stuff takes form. But as the years go by, I feel like you start on a later draft, you know. And again, there's these moments, you know, a book usually takes me a few years for a rough drafts and then a couple of years of rewriting. Like this one came to me the way a short story does. It was like a dream, you know. I just drafted it. I heard those stories about writers, but I never believed them that certain books come that way. I had just finished a draft of my last novel. And this was Philip Roth told me once, we had a nice friendship, but he once told me about like, he was a true like graphomaniac, like never stopped work. He was unbelievable. We don't have time for that either. But about like finishing a book and going to the Museum of Natural History next door to his New York apartment, and then being like, nah, what am I going to do now? Look at this whale. And then he went home and started the next novel. And I really thought about that notion. Like I'd finished a book the day before dinner at the center. I had sent the manuscript to my agent, and I started this the next day. And it was like a weird, I have a Marquez story someone said about 100 Years of Solitude, but it really came like a dream. I just drafted in a sweat for months, so I say plus or minus, I shaved off the whole process. I then did my obsessive rewriting for years, and all that went into it. But yes, they all start at different places in the process, some closer to the finish line, some further away, but there's infinite compulsive iterations. Like I tell my students, I teach at NYU, like, do you want the debut where they're like, oh, that kid, what a legend. She wrote the worst debut in all of history. Like, hats off. You know what I'm saying? Like, put your work, it doesn't matter how old you are. For every writer that's like some precocious genius, I can name you, someone whose work you love better, who like raised her family, raised her kids, and wrote her first book, like Grace Paley, things like people who started at a different point. You should put finished. You can't control anything what happens with a book, like if you get any success in your life or after you're dead, or this book called The Stoner, this guy, I think he passed away. I think it was just a few years after he was dead, someone in London reviewed it, and then it sold. He never knew. I can handle it when they don't know by a century, but by 5 years that hurts. Then he sold 3 million copies. I'm just saying, you put finished work into the world. I would never change a word of anything that I'd written. But yes, they all have, there's extant versions, and then I'll stop this question, but there's one Italian journalist who's really mad at me. He wrote this whole piece for the La Repubblica, the big Italian paper, about the opening chapter of my Argentina novel, The Ministry of Special Cases, and then he got really mad when the book came out because it wasn't there. It became a different book. He had heard an early reading, but he still gets mad at me. He wrote this lovely piece about a section of the book that is just gone.
So one more question I'll take, because I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else's. But just because you mentioned some other authors there, Philip Roth, who you knew, and I know you know Salman Rushdie and many others. You told me on the phone that it's a very small community. Somebody was asking, who are some of the writers that have really influenced you in your work? Both ones that you've met and other ones who you've just had the privilege to read.
Oh, well, yeah, back to like, talking about it's really I feel like a kind moment in literature in a lot of ways. Like, yes, there's everyone has a reviewer, or there's I'm sure there's some beefs and bad blood and all that stuff, but I have to say writers are really nice to each other. Like I have felt over time, like when I was a baby and the older guard like welcoming us, and vice versa, now I'm getting to the old guard. But yeah, I find it really, really supportive. And I'm very delicate about contemporary stuff because I said, if they're alive, I'm back to certain cultural, ethical, whatever. I'm always afraid of hurting somebody's feelings. You're like, these authors, you name those two. And then somebody other friend be like, why didn't I get listed by Rabbi Sachs? Anyway. But yeah, for me, like really, 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 really what shaped me, like what really got me going when I was, miserable, dysthymic yeshiva student, like in the wrong place and needing a different kind of story. And this teacher put those books. I love like Camus, Conrad, Kafka, all those existentialists. I love them, and then I love the Russians, all the 19th century, like I love the Russian novels. I really love Singer, I just mentioned Grace Paley, and then it's, fine if they're, Marilyn Robinson, who was my teacher, that seems fair, but like, just what a great living legend, like Laurie Moore's stories. I mean, it's all all over the place. Like, I read broadly and widely, but the start was really sort of that existentialist stuff, and then the 19th century. And again, that's very canon-y looking, and my shelves look a lot more global and different now on in terms of style and form and everything. So yes, I just eat books. But again, if we're being honest today, like right now I just refreshed the newspaper about 94,000. This thumb hurts so much from refreshing the New York Times. It's really bad.
It's tough for me too, because now on our tablets we can get any book we want in the world.
Yes.
But YouTube also is just right there, and Netflix and everything else.
Yeah, and those algorithms know your brain chemistry better. It's really hard to stop. But I'm really working. That's it. Like so many disciplines. I'm really working to like, back to this moment where I've been taking off books, that are on my shelf, like, Colson Whitehead's Nickel Boys I took off the shelf, and then E.L. Doctorow's, Ed Doctorow's Ragtime. It's just nice to like, I just thought I want my brain back, and I'm going to pick books that I know already are fits, and it's really helping me, like, I'm building up my reading muscles again.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over in just a moment to someone else to give you a final word of thanks. But really, I cannot say enough to everybody watching how highly I recommend you go out or immediately go online to Amazon and you check out Nathan's stuff. It's all over. There's lots and lots to read, to look at, and it's all enjoyable. So I want to thank you, Nathan, so much for sharing with us. I want to thank, in particular, the Zalev family for making this possible tonight. This event couldn't have happened without them. I'm going to turn it over to Marcia Zalev to just say a couple of words.
I think I'm still muted. Oh, I'm unmuted. Okay. Nathan, when you meet one of your heroes, you're never sure how it's going to come out. And what I want everybody to know is what immense you are. This evening would not have happened. There were barriers to it if you hadn't made it happen and overcome all of those barriers. And the wonderful part about this evening is I think everybody else will see what immense you are too, because you've really been so open and willing to share yourself with us. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's been
You're so kind. Thank you so much.
I only tell the truth. And
right.
Rabbi Sachs, I want to thank you too. You've done a wonderful, wonderful job of interviewing. I know you studied and did your homework, and it's been terrific. Thank you.
I appreciate it. But really, Marcia, thank you for making this event happen, putting it together. And Nathan, thank you again. And thank you to everybody else for joining us so much. Are there any final public service announcements, Nathan, we should add? Wash our hands or...
No, that's,
we had a lot of good ones tonight. So if anything, I hope you take those away. A lot of good advice.
Let's save the polar bears. Okay.
Anyway. All right, have a good night, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye. Thank you.